Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
John Lehman of Racine is the Democratic candidate in the 62nd Assembly District, the election November 6th. John, welcome back to WisconsinEye.
Thank you, Steve.
Former member of the Assembly, Senate, and candidate for Lieutenant Governor. What issues bring you back into the fray?
Well, I was happily retired, and this district is a little difficult to recruit a candidate in from the Democrat side, and I have probably as much experience as anybody in the district as running campaigns. So I thought, well, maybe I can do this, even though it's gerrymandered. The 61, 62, 63, the 21st Senate District, they're all gerrymandered Republican. But I think I could do it. In terms of issues, I was not particularly happy with Tom Weatherstone, the way friends of mine were treated in his office, the way he represented us, the issues that he jumped onto, and Tom is endorsing my opponent. So there's a difference of opinion between Republicans and Democrats.
We're a few miles from the proposed Foxconn campus.
Yeah.
You would not have voted for that package of tax breaks and incentives?
Right.
Why?
Very seldom do former friends or staff call me from Madison, but the day of that vote, all my former staff want to know, how would you vote on this if you were still in the legislature?
Yeah.
And I said, I know what local Democrats are doing. They got some local Democrat support for Foxconn, but I'm absolutely sure I would have voted against it. Looking at the way they figured the multiplier on the effect the whole economy, I wasn't satisfied with that. I thought it was, a study, all of it, even the Fiscal Bureau stuff was based on a study that was really favorable to Foxconn. I felt that it didn't take into consideration the fact that the time value of money. You give money today and you're supposed to be paid off. One estimate was 2045. I'll be 100 that year, so it kind of struck me. But the whole idea of a subsidy, one estimate I saw was $15,000 to $19,000 per job. Well, when I was in the legislature, we certainly like to do economic development. We like to help folks, but the averages back then, I think, were $2,000, $3,000, $2,500 per job. Now we're talking about, 17% of payroll. I don't think we'll ever see that money back.
Do you consider this race a referendum on Foxconn, John?
I do. My opponent has said that this is a tremendous deal, that we should look for more like it. I could just expect that he'd vote for the same kind of thing for Kimberly Clark if it's still before.
You wouldn't.
No.
It wouldn't.
No.
Okay.
And we start going down that road of these massive, unheard of help for private industry, and we're picking winners that I don't think we ought to be picking. So, yeah, I think that's a definite difference between myself and my opponent.
You spent decades as a classroom teacher. There was a big increase, there was a big upper in state aid to K-12 public schools in the current budget. Are public schools still underfunded, John?
Yeah, I think so, because if you look back to what Scott Walker has done through his administration, we still need to do catch up. And the one thing that's not talked about enough is fairness. I think Tony Evers really gets this, but the fairness in terms of districts that have a lot of poor kids, a lot of English as a second language, a lot of special ed kids, low property wealth. Now I'm kind of describing Racine Unified. And you talk about these districts, they do need more help. And especially those districts need strong budgets that don't go up and down, that follow kids through their 13 years of public school education and provide a solid background for those kids.
Mr. Evers just released a plan that targets the 5 largest school districts. Mm-hmm. One feature of that, if you're a teacher in one of the 5 largest, which does include Racine Unified, and most of your students are low income, you would get an extra $15,000 stipend. Would that?
I didn't read that carefully enough to see that. But is
that a good idea?
one of the things that happens is the very best teachers start getting recruited out of some of these districts where it's a hard job. I have taught upper level college prep economics, and I've taught basic 9th grade world history, US history, 9th and 10th grade. And it's like a different world. You know, you have kids that are prepared, ready to go, and you get done with the semester, and you look at your grade book, and wow, two-thirds of these kids got A's and B's in the college prep one. Same room, same school. You look at your grade book of the 9th and 10th graders that have experienced all kinds of school failure, haven't gotten a lot of support through their lives, they're just not on track. Two-thirds of them are D's and F's. And so I've been there. I know the difference between teaching in different locations, and I think it's great to reward folks who are really willing to be in the trenches and really do the hard work. It's easier to teach really, really bright kids and really motivated kids than it is to teach unmotivated kids and to bring them up where they ought to be. We need all these kids in our society to succeed. So any programs that do that kind of compensation and offer some fairness to the kids that are struggling, I think is a good idea.
You watch choice expand from Milwaukee to Racine, now statewide. Has choice been effective in your hometown, Racine?
I don't think so.
No?
I mean, I know my opponent thinks that having all these choices is a great thing, but you're still not on the same standards. You're still not on you're still not asking the same thing of the schools, and it does hurt Racine Unified School District. You know, when Annette Polly Williams started out, it was a poor kids program to try to make some compensation for those kids and give them, where they were in identifiably bad schools, to give them some choices. But we're not at that point anymore. We're having kids leave good schools, in some cases for schools that aren't as good.
With the Foxconn development, so much emphasis, so much debate on transportation. Yet there's gridlock and impasse in the Capitol on how we pay for highways in the future. How should we resolve that gridlock in the Capitol?
I know that my opponent thinks that we should continue to look at borrowing at the levels I think that we've been at, and I'm not in favor of that. I think it's time to stand up and pay and develop some revenue sources. I was in the legislature, and I took a vote to not automatically with inflation increase the gas tax. I've lived to regret that because we haven't backfilled that. We haven't been courageous as governors and legislators and say, hey, we've got these transportation needs, whether they're local road aids or whether they're freeways or bridges or whatever we need. We haven't stood up and said, yeah, we got to pay for it. And I'm talking about Republican and Democrat both. In transportation, we need to look at revenue. And if we move away from gas-powered vehicles, then we need to move towards some other type of system. But for now, we still have a lot of cars using gas, and an increase in the gas tax, I think, would be understood by citizens. It would be the most logical starting place. And whether you have to go to a mileage-based system or a weight-based system or whatever, where the users are really paying for what they're using, I think the citizens get it. I think they don't want to repair their car. They want to have a decent road to drive down, and they're willing to step forward and to pay what they need to pay.
What about the possibility of tolling?
I think that's least popular with most people. I don't really like tolling. I use the Illinois Tollway quite a bit, getting in and out of Wisconsin going south, and it's what they've decided to do. But I kind of pride myself in that we found other sources of revenue. But I would, if I was reelected to the legislature, I'd be willing to look at all the revenue sources. I just don't think tolling is a place to start.
The levy limits that were adopted to control property taxes have been around 14, 15 years. Yeah. Time to get rid of them, ease them, or keep them?
I think ease them, especially when you have units of government that locally are deciding that they're just struggling so much that they have to go to referendum, or that they're just crying for lack of revenue. And I'm talking about school districts that are spending way less than the average in the state of Wisconsin, or municipalities that are spending way less than the average, and maybe they started out on a formula that was, with school districts, and Racine Unified did, where they were kind of lower in the initial formula, and they've lived with that. I think that when you have folks, especially when they're identified in some way as really struggling, meeting public safety needs, meeting education needs, meeting what we need to be done, those folks especially need to get relief.
The UW system budget, we've had a freeze on resident undergrad tuition for 6 years. Should that be extended, the freeze for 7th and 8th year?
I've always looked on that freeze as a little gimmicky. I think it plays to politics, but it doesn't say what we ought to say, and that is that we have one of the finest university systems in America and that we need to support it. If you're going to freeze, then you got to backfill with revenue from other sources rather than freeze and let the university gobble itself and let the university try make cut after cut after cut. You have to be reasonable about it. And one way to look at it, tuition-wise, is to look around the Big Ten and say, well, what are kids paying tuition-wise, and make sure where we are. The freeze in and of itself, I believe, is a gimmick. I believe it's a political gimmick. I believe that it's important to fund the university system. When we concentrate on what it costs students, we need to talk about student financing, refinancing of loans to go to school. We need to look at basic education opportunity grants and helping poor kids get in, and making it more affordable and making it so that students can, of all income levels who are talented especially, can really get into our university system. But the freeze, I think, is basically a gimmick.
The $100 million fund for school safety grants, is that enough, or do we need to change gun laws, John?
I don't know how long your memory is, but I chaired a legislative council study on school safety. And one of the proposals that we had was to allow school districts to go above revenue limits when they locally, local control, when they really felt that they had needs to put in metal detectors or whatever they needed for school safety. And yes. I still believe that that's the way to go, that you need to, a one-time grant, that's one thing. It reads, you can make politics out of it. But in terms of really long-term safety needs, I think that something like being able to go above revenue caps for identified school safety uses, that's something that we ought to look at.
Let's turn to health care. Southeast Wisconsin is one of our most urban areas, but what are your thoughts on how to protect and expand healthcare in rural Wisconsin?
Yeah,
rural.
we have the 62nd has some rural areas, but they're not these gigantic distances from clinics and hospitals and whatever. But yeah. If you look at northern Wisconsin, I think it's definitely a role of the government to be involved with the dental schools and the medical schools, like we are with the Medical College of Wisconsin, to make sure we're developing programs and leading physicians and dentists and other healthcare providers into service in the rural areas. I think helping with telemedicine is a definite government function to make sure that everybody has broadband access in those very rural areas, and to support actual bonding and building of facilities that need to serve a rural population. So even though we're southeastern Wisconsin, we're more densely populated, I'm well aware of the challenges, because we've talked about it for years, of those sparsely populated areas where you really have to get, especially an aging population, to healthcare.
Hospitals and medical providers are saying that our Medicaid reimbursement rates are so low. Are we at a tipping point where our low MA reimbursement rates are threatening healthcare?
I saw that in my career, especially with dentists, where you're looking at large numbers, especially of children without dental care. So the more that we can help those MA rates, I think Scott Walker did a terrible thing by turning down federal assistance on the pretext that we might get trapped into helping with people with health care all by ourselves without federal help in the future, which may or may not happen, But I do think that we need to be very conscious of that. We do have these federally qualified health facilities that sometimes fill in the needs, and we have to go at that. But the reimbursement rates are one thing to definitely look at.
Are you hearing from caregivers that there's an issue? AARP estimates that there are 578,000 Wisconsin residents who are caregivers for family members or neighbors.
Yeah.
Would you support laws or rules that require hospitals to recognize and work with family caregivers
I would.
when a loved one is
I would, and
hospitalized?
I support those caregivers' right to organize collectively to try to get their wages up, to try to make that more attractive. It's very hard work. I just lost my father a few years ago, and we had caregivers in the house for a number of years. My mom has had folks in and out of the house, and I know how important that is, but how tough that work is. You know, you got, and really, you talk to the caregivers that work for some of the agencies, and their reimbursement is really not satisfactory. You're not talking about a living wage of somebody who's doing that kind of work. So it's some place we ought to really be looking all the time. Our population is aging, and the more help we can give in that direction, the better.
Your position on bills in the Capitol that would legalize recreational and medical marijuana?
Yeah, I have had, when I was in the Senate, I've had in my office a number of folks really were suffering nausea with cancer they were smoking marijuana, you know, illegally. And I just, you know, I felt bad for those folks. You know, and I know there's a difference, there was at the time at least, a difference between the doctors' and nurses' attitudes. The nurses were a little stronger in favor of allowing medical marijuana, especially for nausea. But I'm very willing to look at that. I think other states have looked at recreational marijuana. There is some revenue. I think you have to be careful about it. I know there's some proposals about making sure that localities have licensing rights for facilities that would make recreational marijuana available for sale. I think there's a lot of corollary questions to look at, but I don't have the view that the marijuana immediately leads to opioid addiction, or that it's a terrible thing. I put it more in the class of, you know, you shouldn't be smoking marijuana. You know, it's regular tobacco. You know, and I'm not jumping up and down saying it's the number one thing that everyone has to support in the state legislature. I think it needs a good debate, but I'm open to it. I think that debate has taken place in other states.
You're going for an open seat. You've talked about some differences with your opponent. Any other differences you want to highlight?
Well, I think in terms of personal differences, I'm the experienced candidate who could start from day one, and he's not. He's in the first term of the school board. But in addition to that, he has the view, and he stated this publicly, he has the view that I'm a corporate accountant. I'm come out of the corporate background, and that he's even, I think, arrogantly said, well, who would ever say we don't need more people with a finance and accounting background in the legislature? Well, I say that because I don't believe that someone with that accounting background necessarily sees the big picture. My background, teaching and going to school, is pretty heavy in economics. But if you're going to deal with public policy, you want to deal with externalities of any kind of project that happens, not just the balance sheet that the accountant has been dealing with. You want to look at long-term implications. You want to look at certainly the long-term paybacks on different kinds of projects. And I think that the narrow accounting pro-business, I just want to help business any way I can, is short-sighted. I just think there's a little hole there where you don't quite see the whole picture. Don't look at it from the taxpayer's point of view and from the regular citizen's point of view. I really think that I do think about it from, you know, the point of view of the man on the street a little more than somebody coming out of that corporate accounting.
Thank you. John Lehman of Racine is a Democratic candidate in the 62nd Assembly District. The election is November 6th. John, thanks for visiting with WisconsinEye.
My pleasure. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.